Hello, and welcome to the Her Head in Films podcast. I'm your host. My name is Caitlin. On this podcast, I share my personal thoughts and feelings about the films that I watch. I tend to focus on art house and world cinema. On today's episode, I will be talking about a very intense film about war. It's called Come and See, and it's from 1985, and it's a Soviet film. And so I had a really intense experience of watching this film, and I wanted to talk about it, and I wanted to dig in to everything about this film and why I think it is probably one of the most important films ever made. And it's really a monumental, very serious film about war, violence, and horror. And so I will be digging into that film shortly. If you're new to the podcast and you don't know who I am, as I said, my name's Caitlin. I'm a writer, I'm a dreamer, I love literature, art, and poetry. I'm someone who's very curious about the world, curious about other people, other lives, and I crave knowledge, and I just really love art in all of its forms, whether it's cinema, literature, music, dance, all kinds of forms of art. I feel very enriched by them, but cinema as an art form has really taken over my life in the last few years. I really got into art house cinema around 2011, and ever since then I have just been madly in love. So this podcast is my outlet. It's the way that I express how I feel about all these different films that I watch, and I live in a rural area. There is no art house movie theater where I live. There's no access to any kind of cinephile culture. So I'm really creating a space for myself through this podcast to explore all the films that I love. This podcast does have a Patreon where you can financially support it. I have all kinds of rewards and extras available to people who become patrons, including bonus episodes. You can find my page at patreon.com/herheadinfilms, and Patreon is spelled Patreon. At one level, you can get a shout out in each episode, so I just want to take a second to do my shout outs. So I'd like to give a shout out to Carolyn, Feminist Overlord, Michelle, Jessie, Lindsay, and Olivia. Thank you all so much for being patrons. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you who listen, who share, and I understand that not everybody can financially support the podcast. Some things that you could do that are totally free, or you could share the podcast on social media when I release the episodes. And if you use iTunes, I would really love it if you could leave a review of the podcast there. Reviews help it get better placement in the directory, in like the TV and film category on iTunes, and it would just be really helpful. It would take like probably a few seconds or a minute, and just leave a review, and saying that you love the podcast or you enjoy what I'm doing. I would really appreciate that, and that's something that you could possibly do if you'd like to. So I'm going to talk about Come and See, but before I do that, I want to talk about something really recent that happened. Time magazine released its Person of the Year, and they chose all the women that have come forward and spoken out about sexual harassment. And Ashley Judd is on the cover, and she's an actress, as many of you know. And as we know, the Harvey Weinstein scandal really broke things open when it came to this conversation about sexual harassment and sexual assault and sexual violence against women and also men. Some revelations have come out about the way men have been treated as well. Terry Crews has been very honest about that, and we've heard about violence against children in Hollywood and children being molested. So this is a big cultural moment. I've talked about it on other episodes of the podcast, and I've expressed a fear and a worry that it will not lead to systemic or institutional change. I don't know if I've seen that yet. We do see some people losing their jobs, but I'm still, there's like this part of me that is still a bit, I don't want to say cynical, but is just worried, that when the attention dies down, and will men keep getting away with these crimes and with this violence? And I think this is an important first step, and I think a lot of people are saying, oh, this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. I think we need to temper that a little bit. I'm skeptical is what I'm saying, because we also have something happening right now with Roy Moore, where he's been accused by half a dozen women that he harassed and assaulted them when they were teenage girls, and he is getting even more support from people. So on the one hand, I think we see some progress in certain areas, like in Hollywood and places like that. But in the realm of politics, we're seeing women who have come forward and accused Roy Moore, and they're not getting lauded. They're not getting, he's not stepping down. He's not losing support. If anything, he's gaining support. And there are a lot of people that don't believe the women and don't believe the allegations. And so I think that we need to be realistic. I think we certainly should hope that this is a big moment, that things are going to change, that women are going to get more respect, and that, the violence that they face will change. It's just, what I'm trying to say is that this visibility of an issue does not always translate in on-the-ground change. Look at, in the last few years, the explosion of trans women in media, especially trans women of color, like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox. We've seen this big shift, right, in representation in television, especially, of trans women. And yet trans women continue to be murdered at very high rates. And transgender people continue to face violence and discrimination in their everyday lives. So we have people talking about the issue. We have this visibility of transgender people, but that hasn't necessarily materially changed the situation for transgender people. So we still have a lot of work to do, is what I'm trying to say. Is the conversation's happening. It's happening on social media. It's taking place, and it's taking place in the media. But when women go to work, when a housekeeper goes to her job, when a waitress goes to her job, when a woman goes to a factory and her boss is coming on to her, what is the recourse for those women, and how will their lives change? And that's what I'm still worried about. But I am so glad that Time magazine chose these women. And several days before Time magazine released their cover, that was my choice. I tweeted I said that my choice would be everybody who's come forward about sexual harassment and sexual assault. I think it's brave. I think it's courageous. I think it's necessary. I think it has changed the conversation. It has made sexual violence more visible, and I would never say that that's a bad thing. That is a very good thing, that the silence has been broken about this. Let's just keep in mind that we still have a lot to do, and that women are still not equal. Women are still fighting. Women are still struggling, still being hurt, and that our work continues. It always continues, right? All right, on to our film. So this film is called Come and See, and it is a Soviet film. It's made by a director named Elem Klimov, and it was released in 1985. I don't know how many people have heard about this film or have heard of Klimov, but this is a film that I had wanted to watch for years. This is one of those films that has just always been on my watch list. It's always interested me. I have a huge interest in Soviet cinema. Few things move me quite as much as Soviet cinema. I have seen some tremendous, extraordinary films. Some of my favorites are The Cranes Are Flying. That's a really good one. Letter Never Sent. That's by the same director. Ballad of a Soldier. Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, Larissa Shepitko's The Ascent, which is also a war movie, and Larissa Shepitko was actually Elem Klimov's wife. She tragically died, though. She died quite young, I think. But she also made a masterpiece about war, which is called The Ascent. I'm a big Andrei Tarkovsky fan, of course. My favorite film by him is The Mirror. And so that's another film that I really love. So I think I've named all my favorite. Oh, Man with a Movie Camera. That is such an amazing film. A very early Soviet film, I think from the 1920s or 30s. I still need to watch some Eisenstein. I haven't explored his work yet. Still have a few by Tarkovsky that I need to explore. But Soviet cinema is just fascinating to watch, and especially the Soviet films about the war, about the Second World War. And Come and See is set during the Second World War. The Soviet Union, they lost millions and millions of people. They incurred huge amounts of loss during that war, as did a lot of Europe. I mean, the Second World War is a cataclysmic event, and it's something that interests me. I watch quite a few films about it, actually, whether it's what Germany went through, or Japan went through, or the Soviet Union, or Poland, or I recently saw Ashes and Diamonds and Kanal, which is two Polish films. So I'm interested in the experience of World War II for everybody that was involved in it. And the more films that I watch about the Second World War, the more I am just astounded that anybody survived. I mean, you have places being completely leveled. You have cities reduced to rubble. You have starvation, you have atrocities, you have the Holocaust, obviously. Like, how did anybody survive this war? I just don't know. And, I think the Second World War has a lot to teach us, and I think it has a lot to show us, especially with the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazism, and authoritarian, totalitarian governments. And I think it can, and the way propaganda was used, especially in Germany, I see parallels between that time and now. It's not exactly the same. You can't make, broad generalizations, but the way that a charismatic leader can become very powerful, the way people can be convinced of things, of lies, of propaganda, I'm seeing things like that happen here in the United States with the presidency of Donald Trump. I'm seeing a portion of our population profoundly disconnected from reality and facts, and buying into right-wing extreme propaganda. And so I always turn to the Second World War, because I just think it has a lot to show us in that way. But Come and See is, it's an extraordinary film, and I really feel like it's become a part of me. It's a very graphically violent film. It's about the Nazi invasion of Belarus. Which those of you who are aware of that country, it's Belarus. And it was just a lot of atrocity happened in Belarus and throughout the Soviet Union when the Nazi invasion happened. And I'm going to go into more about that later on in the review. Right now, I'm just at a stage where I want to talk in a more general way about the film. And it's about a young boy, and it's about him witnessing the atrocities that the Nazis committed against villagers in Belarus. So that is sort of a basic outline. If you haven't seen the film, there will be spoilers. I will be talking in depth about the film in this review. So if you'd rather not hear that, then don't listen. Or if you have seen the film, then you have no issue, right? Like I said, I'd wanted to see this film for years. I saw it via the website filmstruck.com. I don't have any kind of partnership with them or sponsorship. I don't get anything for mentioning them in this episode. It's just a streaming site that I use. And the Criterion collection is part of Filmstruck. There's Filmstruck, which is one part, and you get access to certain films. And then there's this other thing called the Criterion channel that is sort of an add-on. And that's where Come and See was playing when I watched it. I don't know when it might expire, but to see this film, that's how I saw it, was via Filmstruck. I'll probably never watch this film again. This will probably be the first and last time that I watch this film. But I don't think that I necessarily need to watch it again, because I think this is one of those films, and this is why I say that it's monumental and, dare I say, life-changing? I don't know. I would say it's life-changing. I mean, it's just one of those films that, it's rare that you encounter something so visceral and so powerful, and I find certain scenes of the film playing in my head now. I mean, this is what films do. They sort of implant these images in your head, and you can never get them out again. It becomes part of your being. It becomes part of you. It's a brutal film. It's a grueling film. It's more than 2 hours. It's 2 hours, 22 minutes. But this is a serious film. It is serious, deeply serious, about showing human suffering and the horror of war and violence. And I'm doing this episode. I hadn't planned on it. There are certain films that I will not do episodes about because I don't feel capable of it. I don't feel, or it feels so much bigger than me. It feels like there's no way I could talk about this film. There's no way I could do justice to this film. This is one of those films where I feel that way, honestly. I hadn't planned on doing an episode, but the day after I watched it, thoughts started to form, and I started to feel things, and I started to outline this episode, and I started to write down thoughts, and something started to form inside of me. And so I knew that I needed to do an episode, that it was an imperative that I do an episode, and that I record my reaction to the film, and that I explore my reaction, and that I explore the film itself. And I really feel like my skin has been ripped off with this film. It leaves you completely raw, and you just feel like your skin's been torn off. I had to stop several times as I was watching it. I can't imagine what it was like for people to see it in a theater. When it came out in 1985 represented the 40th anniversary of the Soviet victory in World War II. Because World War II, for those of you who are maybe not knowledgeable about it, lasted from 1939 to 1945. So 1985 represented the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II and the Soviet victory. And it was actually a very popular film. Tens of millions of people, at least in the Soviet Union, saw the film. It was actually a very big hit. And as I say, this is a war film, but for me, I would almost categorize this as horror. To me, this is horror, you know. I know a lot of people like vampire films, and they like zombie films, and, you know, there's a lot of people that love horror films, and they love that genre. I don't watch a ton of horror films. For me, films about World War II, films about war, are horror films. This film, the real horror about this film is that it happened. That a lot of what is in the film is based on eyewitness testimony, and the real experiences that people in Belarus went through during World War II. And it is truly horrific. And, you know, why talk about a film like this? Why watch a film like this? I'll talk about that more at the end of the episode. But right now, I just want to say, I know that this is a hard subject matter for some people, that especially here in the United States, we like our war films in a particular way. We like war films that are patriotic. We like war films that make the United States especially look like heroes and good guys. We like a linear narrative, and we like a good guy and a bad guy, and we like to reinforce this narrative of good versus evil, and good always overcomes evil. And they like the violence to an extent. They like the violence if it's the hero, doing the violence to the bad guy, and to the bad guy who's very dehumanized and, just he's pure evil, and here's the good United States American guy killing him or shooting him. We like this mythology, and we like this nationalism and patriotism with our war films, especially, I think. We don't take to gritty war films to more artistic war films. I would say this is artistic, that it is, it's saying something about war in a more nuanced and complex way, in a way that I don't think a lot of American audiences would like as much. It's almost a fragmented kind of film. It's hallucinatory. It's really surreal in some ways. I think it would be hard for like a mainstream audience to follow it. And it's very realistic, almost hyper realistic, where you feel like you're watching a documentary opposed to a feature film. And I think that's why I myself had to stop at times, because it was so difficult to watch. It felt very real at times and very, very intense. But I think films like this are important because I think they can change people. I think they can affect people who are open to them or who see them. And I wish more people would see films like this about war. And I think the way we react to films like this, and how we react in general to stories about war, violence, genocide, atrocity, I think that means something. I think making these films means something, and I think our engagement with these films means something. And that it matters. It matters profoundly. When people go to a mainstream war film and they just get this particular narrative reinforced to them, that good triumphs over evil and the American is always the good guy, when you never see anything that's critical, or that, and what I'm also trying to say is that films like that glorify war and they romanticize war, and that's very dangerous. To make war look heroic, to make it look fun, or to make it look, to make that violence look sexy, or beautiful. The aesthetics of violence, the aesthetics of war is profoundly dangerous, I think, to make that seem beautiful, And Come and See does not do that. You do not come away from this film thinking, you know what, war is amazing. War is great. That's what I want to do. You get what I'm saying? It shows the bare reality. And how war gets represented means something. What is shown, what is not shown. What can the audience bear? What can the audience not bear to see? What narratives are being reinforced? How is masculinity being shown? How is violence being shown? All of this matters. It matters profoundly. It's still so strange to me, living in the United States, that we have two wars going on. We have a war in Iraq and a war in Afghanistan, and we have no idea what in the world is happening. We're not informed. It's completely two hidden wars. We know absolutely nothing about it. And we only see one side of it, always, the American side. And then, of course, the other side is dehumanized and demonized in a lot of ways. But that's neither here nor there. But what I'm saying is that war films matter. And this film in particular, I wouldn't say it has an agenda. I wouldn't say it has this agenda to be anti-war or anything like that. But it it shows war in all of its horror, and it doesn't back away from that. And so I think that can be really challenging for certain audiences. But I think if there is someone in the audience, or the audience in general is open to being challenged, to seeing something that's raw, to seeing something that is much more authentic and complex, then I think a film like this could change someone, or it could affect people and change the way they see war, the way they see violence. So I do want to give a little bit of background about the film. As I say, it was directed by Elem Klimov, and I'll just say from the outset, I did my best with these names, with these Russian and Soviet names. I looked for pronunciations. It was not easy. Some of them I have just kind of had to go with my gut, that this is maybe how it's pronounced. So I don't mean any disrespect to anybody who may be, from these regions or know about the language better than I do. I'm just doing my best, but I really wanted to talk about this film, and I didn't want to let errors in pronunciation keep me from talking about it, and so I've just done my best. As I say, this film came out in 1985, but it actually took almost a decade for Klimov to get it made. The Soviet censors had a lot of issues with the script, I think. I watched this really great interview with Klimov on YouTube. It's in 3 parts. The title is Elem Klimov on Come and See. I don't know the source of the interview. I don't know what year it was made. He died in 2003. He looks pretty old in the interview, so I'm thinking it was maybe 2000, 2001, something like that. He said, and so a lot of the things everything that I say that's quoted by him is from that interview, and it's his own words. But he said he wanted to make a serious film about war because the war had impacted him. He had gone through the Second World War. Let me see when he was born. He died in 2003, as I say. Let me see. He was born in 1933. Okay. So he was quite young when it happened. He was born in Stalingrad, in Russia, and he saw bombings, and his family, I guess he had some siblings, he was with his mother, they crossed the Volga River in 1942, and in that interview, he describes the river and the city as being ablaze during that crossing. He also described his mother covering him and his siblings with like blankets, but also covering them with her body. And he said his memories of that experience are very strong, his memories of the war. And he said that, crossing the Volga, going through all that, he said it was, quote, an excursion to hell, and it lives in me forever, unquote. So I think in many ways, Klimov's need to he wanted to make a war film. He said that I had to make this film. So I think it comes from a very personal place in a way. Even though he is not from Belarus, he was from Stalingrad. But he wanted to talk about the Second World War, and he wanted to make a serious film, and I think that is his own word, serious, about the war, because this is something that lives inside of him, something that scarred him and wounded him and haunted him. And so making this film comes out of a very personal wounding in his own life. But then, of course, I think he's trying to commemorate what happened. He's trying to preserve and document these stories, and I'll talk more about that. He wrote the screenplay. He co-wrote it with a writer named Ales Adamovich, who actually wrote a novel about the Soviet occupation of Belarus during the Second World War. The film itself was filmed entirely in Belarus, so Everything you see in the film, it is in Belarus. The original title of the film was Kill Hitler, which is very interesting. Those of you who have seen the film, you know that at the end, the young boy, Florya, he actually shoots this picture of Hitler. He finds this picture in like a mud puddle, and he shoots the picture over and over again with his gun. And it's a very interesting ending. It shows archival news footage of the war and different places during the war and bombings and different things. But then it shows them being reversed. And so there is this idea, he's shooting this poster of Hitler almost as though he could have killed Hitler. You know, that if somebody had killed Hitler, say when he was a child or when he was an adult or anything, if he had been assassinated at some point, then all of history would be different. If somebody could have killed Hitler, if somebody could have stopped him. And Klimov says, in his own words, he says that title, what he meant by it was not literal, you know, kill Hitler, but he said, quote, kill a Hitler in yourself, unquote. And he was talking about how inside of people they have demons, you know, those sort of baser instincts of people to buy into nationalism, to buy into right-wing extremism or fascism. So that original title, Kill Hitler, that's what he's trying to say. I would almost take it even further, and I would say we need to try to stamp out that kind of extremism before it grows. And so the ending brought that to mind for me too, is that if you could have stopped Hitler somehow, if you could have stopped some of the conditions that allowed him to become popular and to take power, and how different history would have been, how different the world would be. And so it's very disturbing to me to see people in my own country espousing Nazi and fascist ideals. It's very disturbing. Recently, the New York Times, there was a really big controversy recently because they did a profile on a Nazi, on somebody living in like a rural area. I don't know where it was though. Where did he live? I don't know. But it was sort of like the Midwest, I think. And it was just this very strange profile about him. It did not challenge his Nazi views, his fascist right-wing views about people, and he said some terrible things about Jewish people, about all kinds of different people. And I mean, make no mistake, this Nazi rhetoric is violent. You know, it's when they talk about wanting a world of white people, that's violent. What do they need to do to achieve that world? They need to get rid of anybody that doesn't fit into that idea. You know? It's a violent rhetoric. It's a violent philosophy. And yes, it's words, but it leads to violence, as we saw in Charlottesville months ago here in 2017, where there was a Nazi rally and a young woman named Heather Heyer was run over by one of the Nazis at that rally. It's a violent ideology, and it must be confronted, it must be interrogated, it must be critiqued. You cannot just let someone say these things in a mainstream publication without any kind of contextualization of those views. I mean, this profile was profoundly wrong. It was terrible. In this day and age, with rising extremism, we have got to interrogate this ideology. You don't just let people say these things about minorities or about Jewish people or about women and not push back and not challenge them and not confront them. That's not the way it works. And yes, some people like these things where it's like, oh, let them hang themselves by their own words or something. in this context, it didn't work. What it did was make him seem okay and make him seem normal. And unfortunately, there are more people that agree with his views than I think we would like to think, and that it is pretty widespread in the country. I mean, how can you deny it when 60 million people go and vote for Donald Trump? So we have a huge problem. But when Klimov was talking about the Kill Hitler original title, that made me think of that, of how do we stamp this out? Because we see where it led in the 1930s and the 1940s. It led to genocide. This is an ideology that leads to violence and genocide, because you're saying that there are certain groups of the population who don't have the right to exist. And that's how you have people in Belarus being slaughtered by the Nazis, is because the Nazis often looked at the different groups of the Soviet Union as lesser than, as subhuman, along with Jewish people that they also slaughtered and massacred. This is where this ideology leads, right? And so that's why the Second World War, it's still so relevant. And yet it is so far away. You know, it's so many decades away. It's this very remote history to a lot of people, which I think is why Klimov and other directors made these films to begin with. You know, for him in 1985, it's 40 years. That probably already seemed like a really long time from the Second World War. I would imagine in his mind, he's trying to preserve this history in some way and to make sure that it's not forgotten, and that what the people of Belarus went through is documented in some way and remembered. And film can be a way of doing that, you know. It can be a way of keeping that memory of the past alive. And but they eventually changed the title to Come and See. And it's from a passage in the Bible that it's urging the reader or whoever in the that part of the Bible to look upon the carnage and aftermath of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And come and see is this phrase that recurs throughout these lines. Wikipedia has the exact lines in the Bible. Just looking for it. It's from chapter 6 of the Apocalypse of John, where in the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th verses is written, Come and see. And here's one portion, quote, And when he had opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the 4th part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. And so I think that echoes Klimov earlier saying, talking about his own excursion to hell, and that a lot of this film does feel apocalyptic, and it feels like you're descending into hell, you know, into Dante's Inferno, you know, and that's what makes it so disturbing, I think. Also, Klimov was inspired by his co-screenwriter, Adamovich. Adamovich helped put together a book with some other authors, and that book is called I Am From a Burning Village. This book collected stories by people in Belarus, and it recorded the atrocities that they had witnessed. And so Klimov, in his interview, he says that this book is a touchstone for him, and it also helped him avoid falsehood. That he is pulling from the actual testimonies. Now, Adamovich had written, I think, a novel about some atrocities, but this film is not an adaptation of Adamovich's book, but it takes from it a bit. It takes from these testimonies. It's its own unique story, but it is based on these eyewitness testimonies of actual villagers from Belarus who saw these atrocities committed by the Nazis. And so I want to talk a minute about something. And I know I haven't even gotten to the film. There's so much to talk about with this film. I want to talk about the film, but I want to talk about other things, that the film is raising for me and that I'm thinking about. So after watching this film, I decided I was going to start a book. And it's by one of my favorite writers called, her name is Svetlana Alexievich, and she recently won the Nobel Prize in Literature. She won it a few years ago. And if you haven't read her book, Voices from Chernobyl, you need to do that. It is an amazing masterpiece. But one of her most recent books, which was actually published quite a few years ago, but because of her Nobel Prize, more of her works are being translated into English. It's called The Unwomanly Face of War, and the subtitle is An Oral History of Women in World War II. Really, it's about Soviet women. It's about how Soviet women fought in World War II. They were on the front lines and fighting alongside men. From the description of the book, it says these women, quote, "These women, more than 1 million in total, were nurses and doctors, pilots, tank drivers, machine gunners, and snipers. They battled alongside men, and yet after the victory, their efforts and sacrifices were forgotten." So it's a book about these women's testimonies. It's an oral history, which Alexievich is known for, and that's what she did with Voices from Chernobyl as well. And so it's really about this forgotten history of Soviet women fighting and engaging in the Second World War. And it's interesting to note that Alexievich was also inspired by Adamovich's I Am from a Burning Village. So it's interesting how this book and this film sort of overlapped for me, and I didn't realize there would be so many connections, and that's why I wanted to talk about it in this review. So this is what Alexievich writes in The Unwomanly Face of War. Quote, "Once a book fell into my hands. I Am from a Burning Village. I had experienced such a shock only once before when I read Dostoevsky. Here was an unusual form. The novel was composed from the voices of life itself, from what I had heard in childhood, from what can be heard now in the street, at home, in a cafe, on a bus. There, the circle was closed. I had found what I was looking for. I knew I would." So this book, I Am from a Burning Village, it inspired Alexievich and helped her figure out a form and a structure for the work that she wanted to create in gathering oral testimony, gathering people's testimony of history, and then putting those voices together and sort of, I would say, especially Voices from Chernobyl, it's sort of this mosaic of voices that she puts together in order to make you feel some kind of personal connection to history and to really salvage history and to salvage what these people experienced. And so I wanted to share a few quotes Alexievich says about war, and then I'm going to talk more deeply about the film. Quote, "War is an all too intimate experience and as boundless as human life," unquote. And I think this is why I'm attracted to certain films about war, is because what you find in some of these films, but especially something like Come and See, is that you find just about everything in the human condition. I mean, suffering, pain. There's some joyful moments. People are cracking jokes. People are laughing. Even in the midst of this horror, there's just, I think Alexievich is very right when she says that. It's an intimate experience, and as she writes, as boundless as human life. It is this boundless experience. And so I think the really great films about war are trying to capture as much of that experience as possible. Alexievich also writes, quote, "I would like to write a book about war that would make war sickening, and the very thought of it repulsive, insane, so that even the generals would be sickened," unquote. And I thought this is the perfect quote to talk about Come and See, because this film is grueling, this film is brutal, this film is sickening at times because of the way it was filmed and the graphic nature of it and the hyper-realist aspect of it, the hallucinatory aspect of it. It makes war sickening. I think it does what it does in cinema what Alexievich is trying to do through writing and through her books. And that is why I think this is a monumental film and a monumental war film, because it makes war sickening. It shows you how disgusting it is, how horrific it is, and it makes that real to you. It makes it visceral, you know. Klimov in his interview talked about how there were women, and who knows if it was just women, who saw the film and they had to call ambulances for these people. They had to be taken out. I mean, imagine watching this film if you went through World War II, if you experienced some of these atrocities, the way some people in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, I'm sure, would remember what they had been through in some of these villages in the Soviet Union, or in the Soviet states. But I think that's a very powerful quote to make war sickening. How do you represent war in a way that, as I said before, does not play into an aesthetics of beauty, that doesn't make it beautiful or glorious or, you know what I mean? That doesn't make violence beautiful. That's really important. So it stars two young actors. Alexei Kravchenko, he plays Florya, and he is our main character. He's about 13, 14, 15. He's like a teenage boy. And there's also another young woman called Olga Mironova, and she plays a young girl named Glasha, who he meets. This film takes place in 1943, if I am correct. Let me make sure. Yeah, it takes place in 1943. Now, the Nazis had invaded Belarus on June 22nd, 1941, and they occupied Belarus until August of 1944. In that period, 2 million Belarus people died, either through these massacres, these atrocities, or through fighting on the front lines with the Soviet army. Over the course of that time from 1941 to 1944, over 600 villages in Belarus were destroyed by the Nazis. This film is an excursion to hell, and it starts with this young boy, Florya, and he's looking for a gun in the sand where he lives in Belarus, and he finds it. He's later sort of conscripted into the partisans of Belarus, just these people who are fighting in the forest. They're trying to fight back against the Nazis, and that is how he becomes sort of engaged in the war. But the partisans go off and he's left behind, and I guess they're sort of trying to protect him. But over the course of the next few days or whatever, he will witness various things, and I'm going to talk about some particular scenes. And I'll talk more about all this in a minute. But there are no heroics in this film. It does not glorify masculinity or violence, but it is graphic and it is intense. Though I thought it was really interesting in that interview, Klimov said that he actually thought the film was quite reserved, and he uses the word reserved. He feels that he actually showed restraint, because he could have shown much more than he did. But if he had shown all of that, it might have become unwatchable for a lot of people. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, here is this film that people are having to be ferreted away on ambulances when they watch it, and he thinks that it's quite reserved. And when I think back on it, the things that make this film so difficult to watch, it's not necessarily that you see tons of blood or that you see, entrails or anything like that. There are various things that he uses to make it a very visceral experience, which I'll get to in a moment. As I said, this is a serious film. It's the film that Klimov wanted to make. It's the film that he felt he had to make, obviously because of his own experience in Stalingrad when he was a child, and also because the people of Belarus had suffered a lot of atrocities. This was, interestingly enough, Klimov's final film. Now, this film came out in 1985, and he dies in 2003. So he went 18 years without making a film. This was his final film. I feel like in a lot of ways it was his last statement. And he described making the film as an ordeal. And I would describe watching it at times as an ordeal. So it sounds like it was just a very grueling experience for him to make it. It took him almost 10 years to get it made. It took about 8 years for him to go from, writing the script and then finally being able to get actors, finally being able to shoot it. So this was a huge ordeal for him, but he obviously would not have gone through it if it wasn't worth it, if it wasn't something that he needed to make. And so now I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of the film, which I know it has taken me a long time to get to this point. I do apologize. I want to talk about how he makes war seem sickening and the tools that he uses. As I said, it's hallucinatory in many ways. There's a surrealism to it, and it's not this straightforward narrative. There's no, I don't want to say there's no point to it, but there's no goal. Florya, he's not trying to do, you think of some of the famous films like Saving Private Ryan. There's a point. These men are trying, they're trying to find this guy, Private Ryan, right? I've never seen the film. But they have this goal, they have this mission. There's no mission in Come and See. It's chaos. It is pure chaos. It is this kid, traveling this landscape of horror, of hell. He's really descending into hell, and he's just sort of wandering around Belarus and seeing horrific things. His main mission is to avoid the Nazis, to escape the Nazis, and to not get caught by them. That's basically sort of his mission. This is not a war film about heroes. It's not suspenseful. It's not exciting. It's not adventurous. It's about blood. It's about mud and shrieking and grief. That is what this is about, and horrific violence that is done to people's bodies. Something very unique about this film is the sound, and I think it adds to the horror of it. There's not regular kind of music or anything like that until the very end. I think Mozart plays in the last scene or something, or some kind of opera. But the sound captured me right away, because there is this scene where Florya, and I will say that the young man who stars in this film, Alexei Kravchenko, he was not a trained actor. He was an amateur, and untrained. And he gives a really great performance. I would really call this one of the greatest teenage or child performances in cinema history. It's extraordinary, I think, what he does in this film. But there's this scene where I think he's with Glasha, actually, and he's in the forest, and the thing that hovers over this film are the Nazi planes, the planes in the sky. It's like, I think it's 3, 4, 5 times Florya will look up into the sky and see the plane, and you hear the plane. It's the engine of the plane, and you know what that means. You know what's coming. It's this haunting, destabilizing sound. It's scary. It's frightening when you hear that plane. And he gets caught in the forest, and there's a bombardment. There's bombs falling, and you see the earth exploding. You see trees being felled and destroyed. You see this landscape just being just absolutely decimated. And then you see the craters in the earth, and because it's so loud, and it's actually really scary when you're watching it puts you right in the perspective of Flora, of this teenage boy, and what that must be to be in the forest and bombs raining down around you, that any time you could be hit. I mean, the fear of it is very intense, and he actually goes deaf for a little while. So we have the sound of the plane, and then we have the sounds of the bombs, and then we have the ringing of Flora's ears, and he can't hear anything. And it just creates this symphony of horror for me, the sound in this film. It's unlike anything I've encountered personally in a film. The sound of bullets. There's this scene where he gets a cow, and he's trying to take a cow or something back to the partisans in the forest, or the villagers or something, and he gets caught in this firefight with the Nazis or whatever, and there's just these guns, just it's at night too, and you can see the light of the bullets. I don't know if it's bullets, or I guess it's some kind of bombs or flares or something like that. I don't know the vocabulary for this necessarily. It's this firepower, and this ammunition going off. And interestingly enough, Klimov said that was real ammunition often that was used in the film. So you have this teenage kid in this movie, and like real bullets are flying by his head. I mean, I question the necessity for that, honestly, because that's obviously really irresponsible, and I think people obviously could have really gotten hurt or killed. I'm not sure why you have to use real bullets for that and endanger people's lives. So I don't necessarily like that, but the sound of the bullets, the sound of the artillery, the sounds of the bombs, that is one way in which this film conveys the fear and the chaos and the horror of war. It is through that. It's through the sound and the soundtrack of hearing. It places you directly in the environment. It completely transports you into this world of war and violence and bombardment, and you're sucked into it, but it's very frightening. I mean, I'll never forget the sound of those planes, and then seeing the plane in the sky, and it's just hovering there, and you just can't imagine that. And then the bombs raining down. I mean, that whole scene was just terrifying, absolutely terrifying to me. I think with this film, Klimov easily could have focused on an adult, but he chooses to focus on children, and he wants to show, obviously, the perspective of the war from a child's point of view. So we're in a child's point of view. We're in this innocent perspective. We're in a perspective that doesn't understand what's happening or why it's happening. And I think that is a really effective way to do this film, is to use children. So there's two major scenes that I really want to talk about that are haunting me and that I still am thinking about. So the first is when Flora and Glasha, let me make sure, Glasha, yeah, I just want to make sure I'm saying her name right. It's when, so he's in the forest, he comes across Glasha, they sort of strike up a friendship, and they go back to his home, to his house, for some reason. And nobody's there. It's empty. He had a mom. He had some siblings. Like, I think he had twin sisters that were younger than him. And so they go back, and the place is empty. And he says, "Oh, I know where they might be." And so they start to run to where he says that he thinks his family is. And as they're running, it's hard for me to talk about. I've never seen a scene like this. As they are running, he's running, and Glosha is a little bit of a ways behind him. And they're running, and all of a sudden, in the back of the house, which they had not seen when they were there, they only went in the house and then they took off. She looks back, and she sees piles and piles of bodies in the back of the house. And she just starts to scream and cry, but she's still running. So it's this very intense scene of grief, of of horror, of fear. It's just I don't even know how to talk about it. Again, I think this is a bit what Klimov means when he says that he thinks the film is reserved and he thinks that he had some restraint, because I think it could have been really easy to do a close-up of those bodies, and I have a real problem with films in the way that some of them, especially when it comes to the Holocaust, represent horror and represent the Holocaust. There was a film a few years ago called Son of Saul. It was a Hungarian film, and I think it actually won the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. And it was about the Sonderkommando at, I think it was the Auschwitz death camp in Poland. And it was about this man, Saul, who is part of the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando were Jewish prisoners who were tasked with basically taking the bodies out of the gas chambers after people had died in them and taking the bodies to the crematorium. And then often the people of the Sonderkommando would be killed themselves so that they could never get out and tell the story of what had happened. I was really uncomfortable with that film because of what it showed. And even though it's in the background, it's sort of blurry a little bit, although I would say some of those scenes were not very blurry. Because it's showing Saul in the gas chambers. It's showing people, and it's showing naked people, naked bodies. It felt, I was uncomfortable with it, and I still can't articulate all my feelings about Son of Saul. I had high expectations for that film, and I left it feeling really uncomfortable about the representation of the victims of the Holocaust and the nudity, and it felt exploitative in some ways to me personally. Other people thought very differently. There was rapturous praise for this film. I disagreed with the praise. I thought it was I'm just uncomfortable with showing naked people, and simulating their death and simulating all of that. I don't know if the camera should go into the gas chambers. Yeah, I'm going to say that. I don't know if art can go into the gas chambers of the Holocaust. I don't know. I tend to think that there are places that art cannot go. That there are places that art cannot represent. And so what do we do with the unrepresentable? What do we do with the unspeakable and with the unsayable? And I just think that there are things that we cannot show. And if we do try to show them, we risk trivializing them. We risk I think we just risk trivializing them in some ways, and and cheapening them or something. I can't quite articulate what I want to say. So what I felt like Come and See did a really good job of is what it didn't show. What it didn't show. Because it showed some things, but it didn't show everything. And that's what, and what we saw with that scene with Glosha looking back at the bodies, we see the bodies for a split second, or maybe a few seconds. We see these bodies piled up, but then we're right back on Glosha and Flora, and them running, and them going, and they go into this bog, this mud bog or something, and so what I say when I say this film is graphic or it's difficult, it's not necessarily because you're seeing, like I said before, you're not seeing entrails. You're not seeing that. There's something about this film that's difficult. It's the sound. It's the bombings. It's so many things, but there's so much there that's implied and there's so much there that's subtle. We don't get a close-up of those bodies behind the house. We see them from Glosha's perspective, and she's several meters away from them. We get a glimpse. We get a glimpse of the horror. We don't get a full-on close-up of the horror. And for me, that's the difference in what makes art great, is that subtlety of not showing the bodies full-on, but showing them from the corner of your eye, of implying that there is no way that you can comprehend this horror, that there are places that the camera cannot go, and there are things that the camera cannot show. And that can be just as important. Think about really great writing. How sometimes the white space on the page, sometimes the silences, sometimes what can't be written or can't be said can be just as powerful as what is written and what is said. And so I think some of the greatest filmmaking is about what is not shown. What is not revealed, what is not exposed, what is not answered. Often that ambiguity is really important, that not everything is answered. And so that scene, to me, was a masterclass in how do you represent horror without exploiting it, without making it pornographic, without turning it into spectacle, the way I think Son of Saul kind of did at times. It's just that little glimpse, that little flash at the corner of your eye. You can't look at it full on. You can't confront it that way. You have to look at it from the side. You only get a glimpse of it. You don't get the full view of it. That is very important, I think. The second scene is when they are rounding up the villagers of a nearby village in Belarus, and the Nazis have invaded. The Nazis have come into the village. There's a ton of them, and they round up the villagers and they put them into this building. It might be a church, and there's children, there's women, there's the elderly, there's all kinds of people in being rounded up and put in this building. And Flora is able to escape. And some people escape it. Not everybody is put into the church. And then they set it on fire. And the thing is that Klimov does not go into the church while it's on fire. We don't see people being burned alive. We hear them being burned alive. We hear shrieks. We hear yells. We hear all of it. We hear the flames. We see the flames. Again, he's pulling back. He is restrained. He is saying, I can't go into that burning church, just like I couldn't go into that pile of bodies. There are places that the camera cannot penetrate. There are places of darkness that we cannot go. But we are from Flora's perspective. So Flora is witnessing this. He's watching it. And then there is this amazing scene that where a Nazi officer comes and he puts a gun to Florya's head, and they take this photo of them with this gun in Florya's head, and Florya probably thinks he's about to be executed, and then they just let him go. I mean, it's, to me, what it conveyed was the arbitrary aspect of life and death in the Second World War. That you were in a building that wasn't bombed, and then a building down the block was bombed, and all those people died. Or I've even heard stories from Holocaust memoirs that I've read of people who, they would go into these villages and they would have the Jewish people dig a big old hole, and then they would put them on the edge of the hole, and then they would shoot them and their bodies would fall into the grave. I've read stories about people where the bullet didn't kill them, and they were underneath all these dead bodies, and they escaped these mass graves, and they lived, and it was completely arbitrary that they lived. It was, there was no point to it. There was no, it was chance, it was luck, it was, you just got lucky and you happened to live. And so when the German officer, the Nazi officer, let Florya go, I was reminded of that, yeah, that's the way some people survived. I mean, some people were about to be executed, and then the person just didn't go through with it, or the gun jammed, or this or that or whatever, and their survival was completely random, and it was completely like they didn't understand it. But that scene of the villagers is haunting, and we see it go up in flames, and it's just, you imagine being a child and witnessing these things. These are things that adults can't even handle. And then you imagine being young or a teenager, and your family's been completely slaughtered, and now you're watching hundreds of people being killed. How does one even cope with that? Like, how do you even cope with that trauma? I don't even know. Something that this film shows really well, and doesn't do it in a graphic way, at least not to me, is violence against women. And it implies the rape of women, especially. And there are several women who recur. I don't know if Glosha is all these women. Some of these women look like Glosha. They're blonde. They kind of have her... Glosha's very pretty. She's blonde and beautiful. I'm not sure if it was different actresses or they all kind of looked similar, but I don't think it was Glosha. I think it was different women. And so we do see a woman at one time, and this is during the church burning, not the church burning, but the people being burned in the building. We see this woman being pulled by her hair. It's this very visceral scene of her just being dragged by her hair. And later on, I guess it's the same girl, I'm not sure, we see a woman, I think she has some kind of coat on or something, but her legs are bloodied. It looks like blood is coming from her genital area and her vagina, and the blood is streaking down her legs, her inner thighs and down her legs. And that implies that she has obviously been raped and that she has gone through a great deal of sexual violence. But the thing is that Klimov never shows it. He doesn't show a woman being raped. He doesn't try to do some kind of rape scene. Instead, he shows the aftermath or the build up to it. And he does show that violence against women. The woman being pulled by her hair. The woman, with blood. She has blood coming out of her mouth. The one that, with the blood on her legs. And we just see, that blood. And that is supposed to communicate to us what has been done to this young woman. And so we are reminded of the atrocities that women went through as well during the Second World War, that women throughout Europe and the Soviet Union were raped. And it was horrific, and it's not a story that gets talked about or told very often. So there's so much going on in this film. There's the soundtrack that is really haunting and destabilizing. There is the withholding of certain details of certain dimensions of the atrocity, where we're only shown things sometimes in a slant way or an oblique way. And there is a restraint there that I think Klimov shows. Doesn't mean that there's not graphic moments, like with the bombs falling, and anytime you see blood, that's graphic, and you see people being shot. You see a man who his flesh has been burned off, pretty much. So you do see these graphic things. He has to show something, You can't necessarily not show anything. There are certain realities of the war that he has to show, but he doesn't show everything. And I think that restraint is what is really important about the film. Shows violence against women, the rape of women. How war was horror for everybody, men and women alike. And the thing about these scenes, and that I was thinking about as I watched them, was that they're not real. Anytime you watch a film, you're watching something that is artifice, that is artificial, It is constructed, it is manufactured, it's not real. It's a set, it's actors, it's, so much of it is fake and artificial, and yet all of those things are used together to try to say something about our very real lives and the realities of the human condition. All of it's simulated, but what the greatest films do, and what this film in particular does, is that through these simulations and through these scenes, we are reminded that things like this actually happened. No, it didn't happen exactly the way that you're seeing in the film. You're not looking at a documentary. You're not seeing a real image, but you're being told stories that happened. People were rounded up and put into buildings that were set on fire. Women were raped in the Second World War. People had their families massacred, and sometimes they saw piles of bodies. It's a reminder that these things did happen to someone, and it matters that they happened. And in making the film, you're telling those stories. You're telling them in a cinematic, artistic way, obviously, with certain artistic license or artistic choices that you have made. You are constructing something, and it is a piece of art, a work of art. But you're borrowing from reality, and you are reminded that things like this happened to someone. Things like this happened to many someones, to thousands and millions of people. And that's also where the power of this film comes from, is that these things happened in over 600 villages in Belarus. These things happened to people, and we need to know about it. We need to know about the suffering and the pain, and that leads me to my final portion of this podcast that I want to talk about, which is, why did I watch this film? I've talked about it's brutal, it's grueling, it's graphic, it's frightening, it's scary, it's horrific. Why would I put myself through that? Why would I watch a film about such a huge trauma? Why do I watch so many films in general about suffering more than I watch films about happiness? I wouldn't say that I watch a lot of happy films, or that I watch a lot of romantic films or love films or anything like that. I would say I'm interested in the human condition, and often the human condition is defined by pain and by suffering. I myself have been through a lot of pain and suffering in my life. I've been through a lot of loss, a lot of grief. I have suffered, and I have been traumatized, and I have struggled to live and to cope with that trauma and to cope with the grief and to cope with the loss of people that I love, especially my father. I talk about it a lot on this podcast, that my father died in 2006 when I was 16, and it was a traumatic event and a defining event in my life. But before he died, I was already interested in suffering and in pain, and I was drawn to art that was about suffering. I was already reading books about the Holocaust. I was reading Anne Frank's diary. I was reading Sylvia Plath and her poems about suicide and pain. So this is a subject that it matters to me, and pain does define our lives. For a lot of people it does, and no amount of joy can cancel out profound pain. I'm just going to be honest about that. I could fall in love tomorrow. Everything great could happen to me tomorrow. And it doesn't touch what I have been through in the last decade or more since my father's death. It does not cancel out his death and the pain and the anguish and the torment that it causes me on a daily basis. It just doesn't. I love nature. I love music. I love art. I love cinema. I've talked about on this podcast how cinema is really the closest I get to religion or to anything divine. And it's even all that, even love, the love of my mother and my closeness to my mother, it just doesn't cancel out the suffering, Those things help you bear the suffering, but it doesn't take it away. And so I am interested in art about pain. I am interested in art about grief and loss and trauma. Maybe I'm looking for, how do other people survive it? How do other people live with it? How can I live with it and survive it? You know what I mean? Maybe I'm looking for that. I think that stories like this matter. I think when people are violated, when people are slaughtered and massacred on this scale, I think it matters. And I think it should be remembered, and I think it should be learned, and I think that learning it can change you. Learning about Anne Frank and the Holocaust changed me. It gave me my ethical consciousness. It showed me who I wanted to be. It showed me that all life matters, that it's not okay to hurt people, that it's not okay to hate people, that hatred is not acceptable, that genocide is not acceptable, that racism and sexism and xenophobia, that these are very dangerous things, and they must be confronted, they must be challenged, they must be resisted as much as possible, because what they lead to is violence and genocide and destruction. They are destructive ideologies, always. And if I hadn't learned about the Holocaust, if I hadn't learned about the Second World War at an early age, I don't know who I would have become, because I'm from these very conservative, ultra right-wing areas, I'm from a very rural area from the South, where I was surrounded by people who believed these things, who said things about black people, who showed sexism and misogyny, who didn't like immigrants and didn't like Hispanic people and said things about them. I am from that environment, and I could have easily become like those people. What was different? I was from the exact same area. I went to the exact same school. What made me different? What made it so that I did not buy in to those ideas and did not embrace that hatred. Perhaps it was these stories about war, about horror and atrocity and pain and suffering. And it's like I said, that's what gave me my ethical consciousness. It's what gave me my morality. I don't want to hurt other people. I don't want to be part of anything that hurts other people. I want to be a force for good in the world. And so I think books and films and knowledge and history was part of that for me. This curiosity about other people's lives and what other people suffer and what they go through in the world. So these stories matter profoundly. And I think Klimov had to tell this story, and it was his last statement and it was his final film, but he had to say it. He had to leave something behind. And so I want to end with the words of Svetlana Alexievich, one of the greatest writers and one of my favorites. Also, this is from The Unwomanly Face of War, and I think that it resonates with what I'm trying to say about my need to see stories about suffering and about war and atrocity and genocide, and why I think these stories matter, and so she writes, quote, "I listen to the pain as the proof of past life. There are no other proofs. I don't trust other proofs. Words have more than once led us away from the truth." She goes on, quote, "I think of suffering as the highest form of information, having a direct connection with mystery, with the mystery of life. All of Russian literature is about that. It has written more about suffering than about love." And so that resonated with me, my attraction to things about suffering rather than things about love, I guess. But I think that's a powerful quote. I think of suffering as the highest form of information, having a direct connection with mystery. Suffering is information. These stories are information. And it's being communicated to us, and we are bearing witness to it through watching the film or reading the book or whatever. And in that way, we carry these stories on. And that information is passed to us, and we have to do something with it. And hopefully, for some, it awakens your humanity. It awakens your morality. It awakens your ethics. And you become an ethical being through your interaction and your collision with certain kinds of art. And I think Come and See can be a productive and a generative collision. It can be something that leads people to that ethical consciousness, to that awakening of suffering, of the violence of war, and perhaps makes it so that they don't want to be part of that. They want to resist it. They want to fight against that. And they want to preserve life instead of taking life or hurting life. Because that's what's important, is valuing human life, and not wanting to erase it or destroy it. Because there's too much destruction now. There's too much hatred now. And so I think Come and See is a life-changing film, and I think it can be one of those films where you're just never the same, especially if you see it very young, I would imagine. It has its graphic moments. It has its difficulties. As I said, I had to stop at times because it was so intense. But there is an ethical engagement in this film, I think, through what it resists showing, what it is restrained in showing, in showing things from the perspective of a child instead of an adult. It's just this. It's a powerful testament. It's a powerful legacy that I think Klimov left behind with this film. And I think it's my number one war film, honestly. Like, I don't think anything touches it, really. I've wanted to see it for years. It did not disappoint. It was a profoundly moving, intense, difficult experience. But sometimes film should be challenging, and sometimes it should be difficult, and sometimes we get something out of that. Like, scenes of this film are still playing in my mind. Like, I still see Glasha looking back at those bodies, and I hear her shriek, and I see her in the mud, and those scenes in the mud are very visceral. I feel haunted by this film in many ways. It's why I had to talk about it. And I hope I did it justice. I was so worried that I wouldn't. So it's a film I needed to talk about, and I've said everything that I intended on saying, and I hope that you will see the film, or if you have seen the film, I hope this discussion was helpful or enriching or enlightening in some way. And yeah, thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Until next time, keep watching great films. Bye for now.